Okay, so here we have just to try and describe what is happening with our cameras when we start to import them into Maya, and how to relate them to each other in terms of focal length, film back, angle of view. So here I have, just to try and help you visualize, I've created a rectangle to represent the actual size of the film back from the Sony camera that was used to take a picture of the alley. This is its dimensions, and I've set up the camera properties in Softimage, but it doesn't matter, it's the same in Maya, with the focal length of 8. It came from the photograph, and from looking up online I've looked up the dimensions of the film back, or the aperture, which here is 0.2813 inches across and 0.2109 inches down. In millimeters, if you prefer that, obviously it's 7.144 millimeters across and 5.358 millimeters high. So it's not that big, but if you enter the values incorrectly in your camera fields, 8 millimeter focal length and those dimensions, you get a camera that results like this. And what I've also done is I've created a curve to help you visualize, which is 8 units long, which is the focal length of the camera, 8 millimeters. So it's quite small. If you click on it, you can see the kind of field of view that is generated is roughly that angle. Okay. Now, if you were to go and key this, focal length straight into Maya on the first camera that came out of Maya's box, you'd get some problems because it wouldn't be relating to the film back of that default camera. Maya's default camera comes out at it assumes it's going to be a 35mm full aperture camera, and if we looked at the tables of conversion that I showed you in class, you'll see that they don't relate. In fact, if we look at them side by side, you might get an idea of what I'm talking about. There are the differences in size. The film back of the full frame 35mm camera is much bigger than this, and that has the focal length of 35mm. Now, in relation to each other, in proportion, they're the same, and that's why you will encounter some difficulties if you entered just 8mm into the Maya camera, and hopefully this will help you visualize why. Again, if we just look at them from above, if we select the Sony camera, you can see I've done all of these things to scale. So I've set a clipping plane 3 times the length of its focal length, and you can see the angle there it's generated. If you look at the full frame one, you can see similar angles, and in proportion to each other they're pretty much the same, but it's the discrepancy in size that causes the errors. And what you're aiming to do when you're doing your camera match is to set up the cameras in Maya to accurately match what your cameras have done. So I'm going to flip to another angle, and let's just see what they look like in relation to each other. Okay, if we just leave that there, you can see the film back or sensor of the digital camera is much smaller, and you would have to scale it up almost 5 times for it to match. So that's what we're going to do now. We're just going to have a little look at them scaling up. And as you can see, I've centered them, got them to scale together, and they align with each other. And the 8mm focal length, as it's been scaled up, is scaled out to close to the 35mm of the original camera. Just take that back, and if you look at it from a different angle, line them up, and I'm scaling the camera. Okay, and it's almost, you can't really notice it. The angle's the same. I haven't animated the clipping plane to match, but you can see that the focal length is moving out to correspond with the larger one, and that's one of the reasons that the charts I showed you in class are so useful. We just go back to the internet and we look at them, and here we have all the different kind of film backs and sensors. Here's the one from the Sony, and we have its dimensions: diagonal dimension, its width, its height, And here we have full frame 35mm. It's diagonal measurement, its width, its height, and you can see it's got a scale factor at the side, a crop value of 1, because it doesn't need to get scaled up, its actual size. But our Sony one is smaller, so if we go to the end, it needs to be scaled up by a factor of 4.84. So you need to remember that when you're in Maya. If you're not aware of this and you were to go along and you didn't scale up, you didn't either enter the correct dimensions for the film back of this one into Maya and keep you can either keep these are interlinked. The angle of view, the focal length and the film back are all interlinked. So if you don't have an 8mm focal length, these dimensions, you won't get the correct angle. And the same with this. If you don't have the correct dimensions, the correct focal length, you will get a different angle and you get distortion. So you've got to get all three of these right. So if you use a standard Maya camera, if you wanted to keep all the dimensions of the standard default camera and get your focal length right, you'd have to multiply this 8mm by the scale up factor of 4.84 to get the correct focal length. If you just keyed in 8mm to a regular camera, you'd get a problem. I'll just demonstrate that now. Select this camera and we'll look at it from the top again. That's the field angle of view you've got there. So if I was to bring up its properties and I was to change the focal length of that from 35 to 8mm, that's what you'd get. Because the focal length you've set it corresponds directly to this. It hasn't been scaled accordingly. So it thinks you're shortening the focal length of this camera, which is going to give you a wider field of view, which is going to give you tremendous distortions. So I'm just trying to emphasize all of these things are interrelational. So film back size, focal length, angle of view, all relate to each other. If you don't scale one or the other up, you're going to get some problems. So the approach I'd probably take as we go into Maya, and I'll show you both ways, is to accurately key in the values of this camera, and then you're going to get a perfect match. I'll also show you how you can compensate with the scale factor on the standard one. Just to remind you, you can find out the data of your cameras at a website like DP Review, which will give you the detail on your sensor size. But you could also do a Google search for digital camera sensor formats, and if you click on there, you get a Wikipedia version. There are others, and you can see the different sensor sizes in relation to each other and how much you have to scale up or down. And you get a list and a table which you can find your sensor and go along, find the dimensions and see the scale factors there. But if you have all the correct information, you can just accurately replicate yours. But if you do need to scale one to the other, the information is available. Right, I'll stop talking about this now and show you how it applies when you go into Maya, and we'll accurately recreate this Sony P200 camera in Maya.